The desert swallowed the horizon, a vast, indifferent ocean of sand under a sky that seemed too big for the world. We arrived at Giza in late July, the heat a hammer blow. Ahead, the pyramids rose, blunt instruments against the glare, but it was the Sphinx that caught the eye. Buried up to its shoulders, it seemed to swim in the sand, its face worn smooth by forgotten ages. The scholars, the savants, they saw history. We soldiers, we saw a massive rock, a sentinel. My boots crunched on coarse sand as we set up the perimeter, the distant shouts of men echoing thin in the vastness. It felt like we were building a temporary house in a place that had no need for us, a place that had been here long before men even thought to measure time. Napoleon's army of the Orient, a force larger than any I had known, had marched for weeks across this landscape. The journey itself had thinned our ranks, not by combat, but by the sun and the sheer emptiness. We were tired. Our uniforms, once crisp, were stained with sweat and fine desert dust. A pervasive grime that clung to everything smelled of metal and sun-baked earth. My own tunic, dark blue wool, felt like a constant oven against my skin. Corporal Antoine Dubois, that was my name, late 20s, lean, wiry. I kept my dark hair cut short, my beard trimmed. It was a small thing maintaining order on my person when the world around us was so vast, so indifferent. I preferred to watch, to listen. Soldiers who talked too much often missed the things that kept them alive. Our unit was assigned to the Sphinx. A pivotal, unsettling task, Captain Leclerc had called it. Captain Armand Leclerc, mid-40s, built like a granite statue. His face was stern, weathered by campaigns across Europe, and his neatly trimmed mustache always seemed to point downwards, accentuating the grim set of his jaw. His voice was deep, authoritative, accustomed to being obeyed without question. He was a rational man, a product of the Enlightenment. He saw the Sphinx as a marvel of engineering, a relic, but nothing more than stone. Superstition was for peasants and the uneducated. He maintained discipline with an iron will, a necessary thing when men were tired and far from home. Sergeant Maurice Benois was also with us. A burly man in his early 30s, his ruddy face was often flushed from the sun, or perhaps from the Egyptian spirits he seemed to find with surprising regularity. His uniform was perpetually rumpled, a contrast to Leclerc's severe neatness. Benoit had a booming laugh, a deep, guttural sound that carried across the camp, and he was quick with a joke or a tall tale. He loved to tell stories, especially after a few sips of the local brew. He scoffed loudest at any hint of the supernatural, dismissing it as human weakness, the heat playing tricks. He was convinced of the tangible, the visible, the things you could put a bayonet through. Then there was Dr. Émile Moreau, a savant. There were hundreds of them with the army, scribbling in notebooks, sketching ruins, measuring everything. Moreau was in his late 50s, slight, precise. Even in the desert, his coat seemed uncreased, his spectacles perched perfectly on his thin nose. His voice was reedy, a professor's voice, full of facts and figures about pharaohs and dynasties. He saw the Sphinx as a library, a puzzle to be solved. He gave enthusiastic lectures under the blistering sun, gesturing with thin, delicate hands, explaining the mathematics of the pyramids, the symbolism of the carvings. Most of us just sweated and wished for shade. Private Pierre Lafarge, however, listened with wide, earnest eyes. Lafarge was barely 18. His uniform was still too new, still showed the creases of its packaging. His light brown hair often fell across his forehead, and he had a freshness about him, a youthful enthusiasm that even the desert couldn't entirely bake out. He spoke with a slight lilt, a rural accent, often about his family back in France, a mother, a younger sister. He looked up to Leclerc and me, eager to prove himself, to be a good soldier. He was the youngest, the one who still carried the scent of home. Our first days were a blur of setting up camp. Tents rose from the sand, supply wagons were unloaded, cooking fires were dug. The air, thick with the smell of sand and sweat, soon carried the scent of wood smoke and cooking rations. We established guard rotations, a perimeter around the monuments, focusing our efforts on the Sphinx. It was colossal, larger than any statue I had ever seen, its leonine body half buried, its human face staring out towards the east, towards the dawn, with an expression that was less a gaze and more an absence of one. It simply was. Captain Leclerc was everywhere, his voice cutting through the heat, ensuring every detail was exact. Sentries must be vigilant. This is not some empty wasteland. It is a strategic point, and we are guarding a national treasure for France. He'd paced the perimeter, checking the posts, his boots crunching on the coarse sand, a sound that quickly became synonymous with order. Dr. Moreau, meanwhile, set up his instruments, measuring angles, taking samples of the crumbling limestone. He'd walk around the Sphinx, muttering to himself, tracing lines in the air. The craftsmanship, gentlemen, is beyond compare. Imagine the knowledge required to move such stones, to carve such a form. He was like a child in a toy shop, oblivious to the heat, to the flies, to the sheer dust of the place. I watched it all. The constant movement of men, the shouts, the clatter of equipment. We were a temporary assertion of order, a buzzing hive of human endeavor. But even then, I noticed the vastness, the indifference of the desert around us. The air hummed with the heat, a deep, pervasive drone. But underneath it, there was a profound silence. Not the silence of absence, but a heavy, watchful quiet. The native wildlife, which I had expected to be abundant, was strangely muted. No desert foxes yapping in the distance, no scorpions scuttling visibly across the sand. A few beetles, yes, but nothing more. The cries of birds were rare, distant, and sounded like warnings. After a few nights, the first odd reports began filtering back from the sentries. Nothing concrete, just whispers. Saw something move out there, Corporal. Just a flicker. The sand, it looked different this morning, like patterns. These were always dismissed. Heat stroke, desert delirium, too much time alone under the moon. Sergeant Benois was the loudest to scoff. Seeing things, Private? Perhaps you've had too much of that foul Egyptian wine. Or maybe you're dreaming of your mother's cooking, eh? His booming laugh would echo, forcing a smile from the nervous private. Benoit was a good man for morale, for keeping the men distracted from their fears. He'd tell tales of Parisian taverns, of conquests far less ancient than the monuments around us. I walked my own rounds, checking the posts, feeling the grit of the sand under my boots. I looked at the sand patterns myself. They were subtle, yes. Undulating ridges, lines that seemed too deliberate to be entirely natural, though the wind was a master sculptor. They would appear, then be gone by mid-morning, erased by the shifting air. I dismissed them too. The desert was an alien place. It made its own rules. One evening, as the sun bled across the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Lafarge was on perimeter duty with me. He was still full of questions about the monuments, about France. He shivered slightly, pulling his thin wool tunic tighter as the desert air began its rapid chill. The day's heat vanished with surprising speed, leaving a biting cold. He looked out at the Sphinx, a dark mass against the emerging stars. "Do you think we'll ever see home again, Corporal?" His voice was small, almost lost in the desert's quiet. I watched the boy. He still had the glow of the countryside about him. The harshness of campaign hadn't entirely etched itself into his face yet. "We will, Lafarge," I said, my voice flat, certain. "This is a posting. We do our duty. Then we go home." He nodded, but his eyes were still on the monument, a darker shape now, losing detail in the twilight. "My sister, she's learning to read. I promised her I'd teach her proper French, not just the village tongue." He paused. "She always asks for stories from my travels." He looked at me, a hopeful, wistful look. "What stories will we tell of this place, Corporal?" I gripped my rifle. It was a good thing to have someone waiting. It was a reason to keep moving, a reason to fight. We'll tell them of the pyramids, Lafarge, of the size of them, the heat. I kept it simple. There was no need to speak of the profound, ancient silence that was starting to creep into the edges of my own observations. The moon was a sliver, thin as a blade. My watch began at 2 bells. The desert air biting cold against my ears, making the exposed skin prickle. Sergeant Benois was on the far side near the lion's ruined paw. I could just make out his silhouette, a dark lump against the less dark stone. The wind picked up, a dry whisper that felt like words carried on sand rustling through the fabric of the tents, a mournful sound. Then it died. It just stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It pressed in, thick and heavy, like something breathing just beyond the edge of sight. The usual hum of the camp, the distant murmur of sleeping men, even the restless shifting of sand, all of it was gone. Only the profound, unsettling quiet remained. My hand went to my rifle, the cold steel familiar against my palm, a small comfort. I told myself it was the cold, the exhaustion. But the hair on my neck was standing. It wasn't just the wind. Something had changed in the air, a subtle shift, and my body knew before my mind. The Sphinx stood before me, a massive, inert shape in the stark moonlight, its face inscrutable, ancient, and utterly, profoundly still. But the stillness felt like a posture, not an absence. It felt like waiting. The waiting continued. The desert held its breath, and so did I. The moon climbed higher, casting the Sphinx in sharp, unforgiving relief. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every crack in the ancient stone to hold a secret. I stood my post until the next relief, my senses stretched thin, hearing nothing but the frantic beat of my own blood in my ears. When the relief arrived, I marched back to my tent, the sand crunching under my boots, a sound that now felt unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. I slept little. The reports from other sentries grew more frequent in the days that followed. They were no longer vague whispers of something out there. Now there was a developing pattern. Movement, a private reported, his face pale, just at the edge of my vision, near the Sphinx's shoulder. Another spoke of faint sounds, Corporal, like stone rubbing on stone, a grinding. Always at night, always near the Sphinx. Captain Leclerc listened to these reports with a stern face. He attributed them to the known effects of the desert, the shimmering air, the vast distances playing tricks on the eye, the isolation eroding the nerves. Mirages, men, he'd declare, his voice firm, unwavering. The desert plays games with the mind. Keep your discipline. Stay hydrated. He spoke of exhaustion, of the oppressive heat, of the strain of being so far from home. His words were meant to reassure, to bring order to the unsettling. For a time they did. Dr. Moreau, however, was finding his own kind of anomalies. He was a man of precise measurements, of data. He had spent hours charting the Sphinx's erosion, its specific contours. He had established baseline readings. Now his reedy voice, usually filled with academic pronouncements, took on a thin, almost brittle edge. Corporal Dubois, he called me over one afternoon, his spectacles pushed up his nose, a worried frown creasing his brow. He pointed to his charts, meticulously drawn. Observe here. The rate of erosion along the northern flank, it is accelerated, far beyond what the prevailing winds would suggest, and these micro-fractures, he tapped a point with his precise finger, they were not present 3 days ago, or if they were, my instruments failed to detect them. Impossible. He adjusted his spectacles. The limestone matrix, it is shifting. He spoke of geological stress, of natural desert movements, but his eyes behind the lenses held a new, disquieting uncertainty. His scientific worldview, a fortress of reason, was beginning to show cracks. Then the small things started. The things that could not be explained away by mirages or geological shifts. A lantern left by the supply tent, found smashed beyond repair. Not dropped, but utterly pulverized, the glass shards scattered wide. Water skins, carefully filled and sealed, discovered bled dry overnight, not punctured, but as if the water had simply vanished. Rifles stacked neatly at the edge of the camp, found with their firing pins subtly tampered with, rendering them useless until a skilled armorer could repair them. These incidents were isolated at first, easily dismissed as carelessness, petty theft, or even sabotage from within our own ranks, though no one was ever caught. But they accumulated. The feeling of being watched, which had been a vague presence, began to press in. Men started to look over their shoulders more often, especially at night. Conversations grew quieter, then ceased altogether during guard rotations. The profound silence, once merely unsettling, now felt malicious. It was the silence of something observing, something waiting for the opportune moment. I started my own investigations. I walked the perimeter alone in the hours before dawn, when the camp was at its deepest slumber, the air still and cold. I looked for footprints, for signs of human intrusion. What I found was something else entirely. Near the southern paw of the Sphinx, where the sand was softest, I saw them. Tracks. They were too large and too deep to be human. Each impression was roughly circular, but with an odd, uneven distribution of weight, like a tremendous blunt weight had been pressed down, and the spacing between them was too wide for any man. Yet, they were too oddly formed to be animal. No claw marks, no distinct pads, just massive, irregular depressions, as if something impossibly heavy had moved with unnatural grace. I brought the evidence to Captain Leclerc. I led him to the tracks the next morning, before the wind had a chance to erase them completely. He knelt, his granite face grim. He ran a gloved finger over the edge of one depression. "Desert animal, Corporal," he declared, his voice firm, though a touch less certain than before. "Perhaps a large, unknown species of hyena, or a jackal. The desert is full of creatures we do not yet comprehend." He straightened up, dusting sand from his uniform. "We are in Egypt, Dubois, not the Paris Zoo. Such things exist." He looked at me, his gaze challenging. "Keep your men alert. Double the perimeter patrols, but do not spread undue panic with wild conjecture." He was a man who clung to reason, even when reason stretched to its breaking point. Sergeant Benois, for all his bravado, was showing the first cracks. His booming laugh had become less frequent, his stories less lively. He'd been put on a night patrol near the western face of the Sphinx, a particularly exposed stretch. A young private, barely out of basic training, had reported seeing shadows move, and had been visibly shaking. Benois, instead of his usual dismissive jokes, had snapped at the boy, his voice harsh, devoid of his usual good humor. "You see what you want to see, Private, or what your fear tells you to see. Now stand your post and keep your imagination to yourself." He'd stalked off, leaving the private even more terrified. I watched him. The swagger was still there, but it felt forced, a costume he was struggling to wear. The dread in the camp became a tangible thing, a weight in the air, a constant companion. Men ate their rations in silence, their eyes darting towards the looming monument. The heat of the day was oppressive, but the nights were worse. The cold carried with it an ancient chill that seeped into the bones. Then it happened. It was not a whisper, not a single isolated report. It was a chorus. 3 distinct sentry posts placed strategically around the Sphinx reported it simultaneously. The first was a private, his voice a choked gasp over the field telephone, his words barely intelligible through the static. Then another, a seasoned corporal, swore vehemently into his receiver, his voice tight with terror. And finally Sergeant Benois himself, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a desperate, raw edge of fear. I was in the command tent when the reports came in. Captain Leclerc snatched the receiver from the operator, his face a mask of grim determination. "Report!" he barked into the mouthpiece. The third sentry, One of Benoit's men spoke, his voice trembling. "The head, Captain! It moved! The Sphinx's head! It turned!" Leclerc slammed the receiver down. "Nonsense! Delirium! All of you! Get back to your posts!" But his eyes, when he looked at me, held a flicker of something close to desperation. I did not need a report. I had seen it myself. My own watch had taken me to the northern flank, a vantage point where I could see the full expanse of the Sphinx's face, stark and immense under a quarter moon. The air was unnaturally still, the silence profound. I had been scanning the perimeter, my rifle held ready, when my gaze had fallen upon the monument. For a long moment it was as it always was, an ancient, inert mass of stone. Then, imperceptibly at first, it began, a subtle shift, a slow, grinding sound, deep and resonant, not from the wind, but from within the stone itself. It was the sound of colossal weight, of millennia of stillness being broken. The Sphinx's head, its weathered, inscrutable face, began to turn, slowly, deliberately, not a sudden jerk, but an agonizingly gradual pivot, like a ship turning against a sluggish tide. The movement was barely perceptible, a matter of inches perhaps, but it was undeniable. Its gaze, which had been fixed eastward, now swept across our encampment. It was not a glance. It was a long, unblinking survey, taking in every tent, every sleeping man, every flickering lantern, the light of the moon caught in the ancient stone, giving its eyes a brief, terrible glint, as if reflecting the very stars. My breath caught in my throat. My hand tightened around my rifle until my knuckles ached. This was no mirage, no trick of the light, no delirium. This was a colossal, impossible entity observing us. Its gaze passed over me, and I felt a cold dread settle in my gut, a primal fear that transcended any battle I had ever fought. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, by something that did not belong to our world, something infinitely older and more powerful. Then, just as slowly, the head began to turn back, settling once again into its eastward vigil, its features once more locked in an expression of eternal patience. The grinding ceased. The profound silence returned, thicker, heavier than before. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, the cold sweat prickling my skin. The reports from the other sentries confirmed it. They had seen it too. Not one man, but several. The Sphinx had moved. The camp was no longer a temporary assertion of order. It was a trap. We were not conquerors here. We were trespassers. And the ancient, inscrutable gaze of the Sphinx, which had once felt like an absence, now felt like a very real, very present threat. We were caught in its sight, our small human endeavors insignificant before its ageless power. The dread built a suffocating blanket. We were a siege point, our walls made of canvas and our weapons of steel, facing an unknown, unseen force that was slowly, deliberately revealing its true nature. And it was hungry. The reports were confirmed. The Sphinx had moved. The impossible had happened, and our rational world, the Enlightenment principles that guided us, shattered like cheap glass. Leclerc, for all his iron will, could not conjure reason from the face of such a thing. He ordered stricter patrols, a full alert, but his voice lacked the usual conviction. It was the sound of a man giving orders into a void, hoping they might still hold some meaning. The dread, once a chilling blanket, was now a physical presence, a clawed hand tightening around the camp. Sleep became impossible, a luxury none dared to indulge. Every shadow held menace, every whisper of the wind carried the weight of what we had seen. Sergeant Benois, already on the edge, finally broke. It was his watch again, assigned to the particularly exposed eastern flank, the one closest to the Sphinx's ancient face. The moon was high and full that night, casting the monument in stark relief, every detail etched in pale silver. Too much detail, perhaps. The air was still, heavy, the kind of oppressive quiet that precedes a storm. I was on a nearby patrol checking the outer perimeter when the first sound reached me. Not a scream, not yet. A high-pitched, almost animalistic whimper followed by a torrent of incoherent babbling. It's standing! Benoit's voice, usually a booming laugh, was a fractured shriek. It's shaking off the sand like a dog waking from a long sleep. My blood ran cold. I broke into a run, my boots crunching urgently on the gravelly sand. I could hear other shouts, the growing alarm from the nearest sentries. Benoit's voice rose to a terrifying crescendo, a raw, primal fear that stripped away every ounce of his bravado. It's looking at us, its eyes, they're alive, it's coming for us, the Guardian, it's awake. I rounded a small dune, my rifle raised, my heart pounding in my ears. The scene that met me was etched into my memory with the indelible acid of pure horror. Benoit was there, just at the edge of the Sphinx's massive sandy base, his uniform disheveled, his face contorted in a mask of absolute terror. He was not looking at the Sphinx's face, but down, towards its base, towards where its massive paws would be, if they were uncovered. He was pointing, his arm rigid, his finger trembling. His eyes were wide, fixed on something I could not yet discern in the deep shadow cast by the monument itself. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, falling to his knees, still babbling, still pointing. It moves beneath the sand, he shrieked, his voice cracking, hoarse with terror. It's hungry, it wants tribute, it wants us. Then, the scream. It was not human, not entirely. It was a guttural, choked sound abruptly cut short. Benoit was yanked backward, violently, as if by an invisible, impossibly strong hand. One moment he was there, a man utterly undone by fear. The next he was gone. He simply vanished into the deep, inky shadow at the base of the Sphinx, leaving behind only the metallic clatter of his dropped musket on the sand. The rifle lay there, glinting dully in the moonlight, a testament to his presence just moments before. The only other sign was a patch of sand, perhaps 2 meters across, deeply disturbed, as if a colossal weight had been dragged across it, or as if something immense had erupted from beneath it. The indentations were too large, too deep, too irregular for any known creature. They were like the tracks I had found before, but fresh, raw, leading directly into the impenetrable darkness beneath the Sphinx's massive body. A sudden, profound silence descended, heavier and more absolute than any before it. No wind, no insect chirping, just the thumping of my own heart and the ragged breaths of the other soldiers who had arrived, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the same dawning comprehension. Benoit was gone. Sergeant Maurice Benois, the loud, boisterous man, the skeptic, the man who laughed at shadows, had been taken. And we had all witnessed it, or at least the terrifying aftermath. This was no desert animal. This was no mirage. This was a living, malevolent entity. Captain Leclerc arrived moments later, his face set like stone, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something new. Not just grim determination, but genuine horror. He knelt by the disturbed sand, his gloved hand hovering over the strange, deep marks. He did not speak. He did not need to. The rifle, the silence, the undeniable evidence of Benoit's sudden, brutal absence spoke volumes. The Sphinx, our eternal sentinel, was no longer a monument. It was a monster. The full revelation came with the dawn. The first light of day, usually a comfort, brought only more terror. As the sun crested the eastern horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and rose, a colossal grinding sound began. It was deeper, louder, more sustained than anything we had heard before. It was the sound of a mountain shifting, of ancient bedrock groaning under impossible strain. The very ground trembled beneath our feet. And then we saw it. The sand at the base of the Sphinx began to churn, to ripple, to fall away in massive cascades. What had been a half-buried statue, a torso entombed in millennia of sand, began to rise. Slowly, deliberately, with a terrible, majestic power that defied all logic and all known laws of nature. The Sphinx, the Great Sphinx of Giza, was standing. It shook itself, shedding centuries of golden ochre sand from its massive leonine body like a shaggy coat. Dust and grit billowed around it in great clouds, catching the nascent sunlight, creating an ethereal, terrifying halo. Its massive paws, now fully revealed, were not clawed but blunt, colossal, carved from the same ancient limestone as its head, yet imbued with a terrifying muscular reality. Its legs, thick as temple columns, moved with a silent, deliberate power, shifting its immense weight. The grinding sound continued, a constant, low thrum emanating from deep within its stone musculature, as if the very earth was protesting its movement. Its eyes, once merely weathered depressions in stone, now glowed with an internal, faint amber light, fixed on our encampment. There was no rage in them, no fury, only an ancient, indifferent hunger. It moved its head slowly, scanning the rows of tents, the bewildered, terrified soldiers, the scattered equipment. Each movement was deliberate, each shift of its colossal weight accompanied by that deep, resonant groan of stone. It was not a statue. It was a living, breathing entity, an ancient god-beast awakened from a long, patient slumber, and it had awakened for us. Dr. Moreau, the savant, stood transfixed, his spectacles askew on his nose, his usually precise features slack with a terror that bordered on religious awe. He was babbling, his reedy voice thin and high-pitched against the groaning of the Sphinx, the texts of Thoth, the Book of the Dead, not just guardians of tombs, guardians of the land itself, the silent watcher, the stone heart. They speak of a time when the desert itself would rise to claim disrespect, avenge the desecration. The pharaohs knew. They appeased it. They built around it, but never disturbed its sleep. His words were fragments torn from forgotten scrolls, but they painted a horrifying, coherent picture of a vengeful, ancient power, a truth that shattered his scientific worldview into 1,000 pieces. His intellect, once his greatest strength, now served only to interpret the depth of our damnation. Leclerc, to his credit, fought against the rising tide of panic. He barked orders, his voice raw but still carrying authority, even as his men stared, slack-jawed, at the impossible beast before them. "Cannons! Load the cannons! Muskets! Form ranks! Fire!" He was a soldier, and he would fight, even against a moving mountain. Morale, however, was in tatters. Fear spread like wildfire through the ranks, a contagion worse than any plague. Soldiers, hardened veterans, wept openly or stood frozen, their weapons uselessly aimed at the impossible. The direct attacks began almost immediately. The Sphinx moved towards our camp, its progress slow, methodical, but utterly unstoppable. It did not charge. It simply walked. Each colossal step shook the ground, scattering sand and men alike. The first casualties were not from its direct assault, but from the crumbling structures under its immense pressure. A supply tent filled with precious provisions was simply crushed, flattened into a pancake by one of its ponderous paws. The canvas ripped with a sound like thunder. The contents, barrels of water, sacks of grain, scattered and ruined. Another tent holding medical supplies was swatted aside, its wooden poles snapping like twigs. The beast was not driven by blind fury, but by a deliberate, patient intent to dismantle our presence, piece by agonizing piece. We fired. Muskets cracked, spitting futile lead against its stone hide. The projectiles simply ricocheted or buried themselves harmlessly in the rough, ancient limestone, leaving not so much as a scratch. The Sphinx ignored them. It was like gnats biting an elephant. Leclerc ordered the artillery to open fire. The cannons roared, their iron balls slamming into the Sphinx's chest with explosive force. They struck with sickening thuds, sending chips of ancient stone flying, but the impact was negligible. The creature merely paused, its glowing eyes fixed on the cannon that had fired, then continued its slow, inexorable advance. Our most advanced weaponry, the pride of the army of the Orient, was utterly useless against a creature made of the very earth, animated by a will older than time. I watched, my rifle heavy in my hands, as the reality of our situation settled in with a cold, unforgiving clarity. We were not fighting an army. We were not fighting a beast. We were fighting a natural disaster, a force of nature given form and malevolent intent. Our technology, our discipline, our numbers, none of it mattered. My gaze swept over the shattered tents, the dwindling supplies, the faces of the men etched with despair. This was not a battle we could win. This was not a position we could hold. The Sphinx was not merely defending its resting place, it was taking tribute, claiming what it saw as its due, and it would continue until nothing of us remained. My mind, accustomed to assessing tactical situations, clicked into a desperate new mode. This was no longer about holding the line. It was about survival, about escape. An escape against such an entity would require every ounce of cunning, every last scrap of strength. I found Leclerc standing by a ruined cannon, his uniform covered in dust, his face grim. "Captain," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the din of fear and destruction. "Our weapons are useless. We cannot fight it." He looked at me, his eyes hollow. "What then, Corporal? Do we simply surrender?" "We survive," I stated, the words flat, certain. "We consolidate our remaining forces. We gather what little supplies we have left. We ration them, and we plan our retreat. We find a way out of here, before it decides it's had enough of playing with its food." Leclerc stared at the colossal moving form of the Sphinx, now systematically dismantling another section of our camp. He looked back at me, at the desperation in my eyes, the cold logic in my words. He nodded, a single decisive movement. The granite in his face had returned, but now it was the granite of a man making a terrible, necessary choice. "Do it, Dubois," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "Consolidate. Prepare. We break camp at nightfall. We run." The decision was made. Escape was our only option, and the Sphinx, patient and terrible, continued its slow, deliberate work, ensuring that our flight would be nothing short of a desperate, harrowing gamble. We were no longer besieged. We were prey, and the hunter was now fully awake.